Today is January 18th. It's the 18th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. Today's episode is one of those occasional episodes that's not intended for little ears. We won't go into the gruesome details, but we will be discussing the crimes and confessions of Albert DeSalvo, who is convicted and sentenced to life in prison on this day in 1967. DeSalvo is tried and convicted for a litany of robberies and sexual assaults he commits as the Green Man and the Measuring Man, nicknames given to him by Boston police. But it is his confessions to a series of murders that terrorize the city of Boston and grip the nation between 1962 and 1964 that earns him the moniker the Boston Strangler. As a kid, I remember reading my mom's copy of the book The Boston Strangler, written by Gerald Frank and published in 1966, in the months between DeSalvo's Strangler confessions and his conviction on this day for the Green Man crimes. Frank's book details the murders of 13 Boston area women as they occur alongside the investigation and manhunt for the murderer, including all the crazy sideshow characters who come out of the woodwork. The psychics and the mediums, the celebrity lawyers. And the book culminates in the incredible series of confessions, DeSalvo recalling in great detail the dates of the crimes, the crime scenes, and the crimes themselves, what leads him to each victim, a seemingly random occurrence of events each time, as he drives aimlessly around the greater Boston area, at times stopping in an apartment building he's been in before when he's the Measuring Man, pretending to be a model scout and taking women's measurements for the twisted thrill of it. At other times, picking a building at random, pressing all the buzzers, and waiting to see who answers, making a split-second assessment of the woman who answers the door. Is she alone? Is she guarded and cautious? Or is she too polite to turn a stranger away? After being convicted and sentenced to life on this day in 1967, Albert DeSalvo is returned to Bridgewater State Hospital, where he's been under observation up to this point. A month later, in February 1967, DeSalvo and two other inmates escape. DeSalvo turns himself in a few days later, and he's transferred to the maximum security prison Walpole, where he spends the rest of his days until he is stabbed to death by an unknown assailant in 1973. Before his death, DeSalvo recants his Strangler confessions, and since then, doubt has arisen as to whether Albert DeSalvo really was the Boston Strangler after all. There's never any concrete evidence connecting him to the murders. All there is are his confessions. The 1966 Gerald Frank book seems too good to be true. It's too neat a bow on the unwieldy package that is the Boston Stranglings. It's certainly plausible that Albert DeSalvo commits this series of murders. But the doubters point out that the murders all fit different patterns. The victim profiles are all over the map. Some white victims, a black victim, a 19-year-old victim, an 85-year-old victim. In his confessions, DeSalvo gets some of the details wrong. Another reason some doubt DeSalvo as the Strangler. But with the mountain of details he recalls of the crimes, surely he can't be expected to remember every detail perfectly. I don't remember what I had for lunch today. Okay, it was pizza. But that's lunch every day. I'm getting off track here. The point is, it's quite amazing the amount of detail DeSalvo recalls in his confessions made across multiple interviews. To me, it makes more sense that he would forget or confuse a few details here and there than it does that he would be able to commit to memory all the other details he gets right if someone had coached him, if the real killer had given him the details. Some believe the real killer who coaches DeSalvo is a fellow named George Nasser, also a patient at Bridgewater in the 1960s, to whom DeSalvo originally confesses, and who hooks DeSalvo up with his defense attorney, a young F. Lee Bailey in his pre-OJ days and his pre-lie detector TV show days. Some think George Nassar is the real Boston Strangler, but like with DeSalvo, there's no concrete evidence. And Nassar lacks the criminal track record you would assume as the prelude to the sexual deviance of the Boston Stranglings, whereas DeSalvo is a sexual deviant since the day he's born. Gerald Frank describes in his book the exhaustive sexual deviance of Albert DeSalvo that lasts for many years across multiple continents as DeSalvo serves overseas in the Army. An exhaustive sexual deviance that has DeSalvo assaulting thousands of women, talking his way into their apartments with a modeling con or some other ruse, taking their measurements, fondling them, forcing himself on them, raping them, all over the course of years, all using an MO to gain the victim's trust and access to their apartment that appears by all accounts to match that of the Strangler, whose access to victims' apartments leaves police baffled. No signs of forced entry. The victims all either know their assailant, or they let their killer in willingly. The last of the official Strangler victims, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, willingly lets her killer into her new apartment on Charles Street and is defiled post-mortem in the most horrific way. In 1998, while sorting through a bunch of old crime scene evidence, the Boston PD Crime Lab comes across a blanket among the items bagged and tagged in the apartment of Mary Sullivan back in 1964. The blanket has a stain on it that tests positive for seminal fluid. A few years later, they receive slides with samples taken from Sullivan's body, but DNA tests at the time are inconclusive. So back in storage, the evidence goes. By 2012, technology has improved, and DNA tests come back with a profile. At that point, cops just need a DNA sample to match it to. But Albert DeSalvo has been dead for nearly 40 years. So they track down his living relations and begin trailing one of his nephews. Police retrieve a discarded water bottle that the nephew has left behind. They test the DNA of DeSalvo's nephew against the samples retrieved from the Mary Sullivan crime scene. The Sullivan samples that have been in storage all these years match the familial genes found in the nephew's DNA, proving with 99.99% certainty that Albert DeSalvo did in fact murder at least one of the Strangler victims. Mary Sullivan is the only Strangler victim for which the perpetrator's DNA sample is available. So it's impossible to link DeSalvo through DNA evidence to the other Strangler murders to which he confesses. Albert DeSalvo is never put on trial for the Boston Strangler murders. And perhaps the real culprit gets away with murder. But it's most likely that the Boston Strangler is put away for life when Albert DeSalvo is sentenced to prison on this day in 1967. There are 347 days left in the year.